Tripp goes on to talk about, again, how spanking should make children sweet again. So if they aren't sweet enough after they've been spanked, they'd have to get spanked again. And this reminds me of Wilson, again, that pastor's panel. So yeah, there's going to be spanking, immediate spanking without warning. And then a child is not permitted to have feelings about that. So not permitted to resist, not permitted to question, and not permitted to have feelings afterwards. So, he includes some frequently asked questions where he gives a lot of advice of when to spank, when a child is too old, when is a child too young. And he does not give anything concrete. He does say on page 151, when your child is old enough to resist your directives, he is old enough to be disciplined. He uses the example of a small child struggling against a diaper change or stiffening his body when you want him to sit on your lap. And I think both of those indicate that Tripp has no problem spanking a very young infant and is giving parents free rein to do that. Spanking and this kind of instant compliance robs children of the bodily autonomy they need to keep themselves safe, because a child is not even allowed to, say no to sitting on an adult's lap. So, he is saying you can spank a child less than a year old. He says you have no way of knowing how much a child less than a year old can understand, but we do know that understanding comes long before the ability to articulate. And when asked when a child is too old, he essentially says that, older children lose their fear of spanking. At the bottom of the page, he writes, they fear being spanked. The spanking gives weight to your words. The spanking sobers and humbles the child. As children get older, they get more stoic about spanking. They learn how to deal with it. The intensity of spanking required to make the same impression on a 12-year-old that you make on a 2-year-old would be excessive. He goes on to talk about how their oldest was 8 months old, and they really believed that him trying to pull this 8-month-old, pulling himself up onto a bookshelf, that they didn't want him to do for safety reasons, that he was like looking back and repeating the behavior, that was defiance. This reminds me of the Pearl's teaching. They speak in similar language, Michael and Debbie Pearl into Training of a Child, about infants' curiosity and exploration, that mirroring back to see how something they're doing, how their caregiver is responding, as defiance, as though it's somehow challenging rather than exploring and learning and discovering. So we can probably see how this is really problematic to punish that curiosity, but it also is taking away from children the opportunity to cultivate curiosity and exploration. He doesn't think timeouts are a good idea. He thinks you might need to change spanking as children get older, because older children don't fear spanking as much, and you have to amp up the intensity to make it hurt for older children. So he doesn't like that as much. Other things in this chapter, spanking becomes a tool really to provoke fear. He does name that, but there's a question here of, what if my child says, but I didn't hear you? Says, you should tell your child you are having trouble hearing. I'm speaking to you in a normal conversational tones. I'm in close enough proximity for you to hear me. I think, therefore, that you better start to develop the ability to pick my voice out of the other noise in your world. When you hear my voice, you should perk up your ears. From now on, if you fail to obey me because you did not hear, I will spank you for failing to listen to my voice. Spanking becomes a method of ultimate control. He also says there may be days in which nothing much gets done because of the demands of consistent discipline. And it reminds me of Dr. Vodi Bocham's all-day spanking sessions that he talks about in his parenting teaching. And it's quite common because, of course, it's in the words of the Wilsons, you have to win. If this is your framework, if this is what you have, if you are an agent of God to require compliance through spanking, you have no other tool but all day spanking until you can kind of be thorough enough, as the chapter opened, to really be conscientious enough that things don't get out of your control. He uses some interesting language about holy and unholy anger, again, trying to demarcate why what he's outlining is not abuse. He's trying to really make that point, and it really comes down to whether the process is polluted by unholy anger. And I'll kind of just hold this here. If you want to read this section, you can. But I want to note that, he first of all says every parent has felt blinding rage toward a misbehaving child, which I think is a little bit revealing what it's normalizing. And while I do appreciate that he is saying, look, you should not discipline in rage, he is leaving the parent to determine whether they've resolved that rage and are disciplining in holy anger or unholy anger. And the way the parent does that is praying, going to have time with God. And I think this really does a number on everyone in the family, because for the parent, this sense of anger and prayer and feeling like they're an agent of God to spank, it's all wrapped up together. And for a child, when the spanking does come, they're going to be told, no matter what's going on in the spanking, that's holy anger, God endorsed, and it's mixed up with the knowledge that their parent has prayed a lot about it beforehand. There's just a lot very wrapped up together in there. Again, he reinforces that if you're out in public, you should wait to be home to spank, because our culture cannot distinguish between biblical discipline and child abuse. So he is not asking the question if there's something to consider there. He's just saying, so you should not do it in public. Closes this chapter kind of with a question from parents of like, what if it's too late? What if we didn't do this from the beginning? And he kind of outlines a process where parents could sit down and talk to their children and apologize and then get to the spanking the right way. And this reminds me a little bit of an apology he has in an earlier chapter, where the parent is not apologizing with the child in mind. The parent is apologizing for not following the right rules and practices in their discipline. Of course, I had a lot of compassion, wondering what that was like, inevitably, for children of parents who read this book and thought, we need to do this. Let's call our children in and apologize for not spanking them and inform them how it's going to be. This chapter's a lot. It's a lot. And I think this becomes, because this is through elementary, this becomes a bedrock for this book, because I think most of the parents picking up this book are probably new parents or parents of young children. And so this approach to spanking becomes foundational